On September 23, 1978, two Argentinians were participating in a cross-continent car race known as Round South America. As the two men were racing and were just north of the city of Carmen de Patagones, they would notice a yellow light in the rearview mirror. Soon, though, the light would get closer and the men would have an experience they would never forget. In this episode, we will look at the strange events that happened to the two drivers, 38-year-old Carlos Acevedo and 28-year-old Miguel Angel Moya. In the early morning hours on September 23, 1978, the men were driving and had about 600 miles left in the race. Around 2 a.m., the men decided to stop and refuel in the city of Viedma. They filled their primary tank, which held 50 liters, and also a reserve tank, which held 40 liters. After 30 minutes at the station, conversing with others, the men left the gas station, with Carlos driving and Miguel in the passenger seat. Then, around 3 a.m., the men were driving on a dark, empty highway. They had passed through the city of Carmen de Patagones and were around 20 miles north of the city. Unexpectedly, the men spotted a bright, yellow light in the rearview mirror in the distance. After a few minutes, it began getting closer to the car, and the yellow dot began growing larger and larger. At the time, the men were driving well over 60 miles per hour. Despite this, the light kept getting closer and closer, and soon was almost right behind them. The men believed it was a newer type of race car and began driving on the far right side of the road to allow it to pass easier. Then the light came even closer behind the car and began to illuminate it. It was extremely bright, yellow in color, with small amounts of purple. At this time, something took control of the car. The car was moving forward, but Carlos couldn't tell if he was controlling it. Carlos looked out the window at the ground and was shocked to see the car was off the ground. It was around 6 feet in the air and hovering through it. Even more frightening, the vehicle began levitating higher and higher in the sky. Carlos would later say he was not 100% sure if the engine was on at the time, but he thinks that it wasn't. At this time, Carlos looked out the window again, but all he could see was the blinding of the bright light. Carlos stressed the light was so bright he couldn't see the hood of their car, nor could he even see the dash or his hand right in front of his face. At this time, Miguel was sitting completely frightened. He couldn't speak or move. It's not clear if this was caused by sheer terror or the beings forcing him into the trance. He also said he felt that the light was smothering him. He looked over at Carlos, and he looked like he was screaming, but Miguel couldn't hear anything. He then tried to open the door, but according to Miguel, it was seemingly glued shut. The men inside the light would lose all concept of time. The men seemed to forget what happened to them next, but at some point the men woke up on the side of the road. They looked to the side, and in the distance, a bright yellow light shot up into the night. Miguel immediately felt pressure on his chest and had problems breathing. After some time, he would regain his strength. Both Carlos and Miguel rested for some time, and then Carlos started the car again and continued onward. After around 15 minutes, the men stopped in Pedro Luro at a gas station, which was around 80 miles north of Carmen de Patagones. The odometer, though, showed only an additional 32 miles. According to their notes, the odometer was 44 miles short of the distance between Pedro Luro and Carmen de Patagones. Even more strange, they had arrived in Pedro Luro at 5:10 a.m. If the men had been traveling at around 60 miles per hour, their typical speed, then it shouldn't have taken them more than 75 minutes. In reality, it took 2.5 hours to reach Pedro Luro. The odometer didn't make any sense. The The men had been logging kilometers traveled and where the odometer was at specific times. Perhaps even more strange, the men noted that their 40-liter reserve tank was completely emptied, even though the men had just filled it and didn't empty it themselves at any point. The two men would report the incident to the Pedro Ludo Police Department and speak with Daniel Osimi. Osimi would document the men seemed mentally fit but extremely agitated and nervous. UFO investigator Guillermo C. Roncaron would investigate the event. He would note both accounts were very similar and the witnesses seemed well-intentioned. The gas station worker in Pedro Ludo, named Hector Forchada, was interviewed, and it was found that he remembered the men, especially Miguel, and both the men seemed shaken up. He recalled the men discussing the instruments in the car and whether they had malfunctioned. Even more interesting, Hector told investigators that night he had heard reports of a strange bright yellow light in the sky in a nearby city. One other interesting fact from that night concerns other cars that were in the race and behind Carlos and Miguel. No other cars recalled passing their car along the road. Again, the trip from the north part of Carmen de Patagones to Pedro Ludo should have taken no more than 70 minutes, yet it took over 2 hours. Admittedly, it could be the case the men simply pulled the car over and hid in the dark, but it seems unlikely given how nervous and agitated they were. Carlos Acevedo was born in Argentina, but his parents were Chilean. Carlos had 3 children and was described as being financially well as he owned several shoe stores. Around a month before the event occurred, on August 17, 1978, Carlos and Hugo Proms would depart the city of Buenos Aires for the race. Carlos would start the race with Hugo Proms, but shortly after, Hugo would drop out of the race and Miguel would fill his spot. Miguel was born and raised in Santiago, Chile. Said to be quiet and reserved, Miguel worked as a mechanic, and according to Carlos, he was one of the best in the business. In 1999, a Chilean TV show called OVNI, Spanish for UFO, featured the case. On the show, it was said that Miguel experienced hallucinations as he was falling asleep after the event. While this case is based solely on eyewitness testimony, it has many characteristics of both UFO encounters and alien abductions. The men witnessed bright lights, experienced lost time, and also documented strange activity that, if true, simply could not be explained. Several independent people who talked with the men in the early hours noted just how shook up they were. In time, the men appear to have gone on and lived full lives. They have done several interviews in past years regarding the case.